She walked down the aisle in a dress her cousin chose, and that's when she knew she was already dead. Not literally, but the kind of dead that happens when everyone in the room is smiling at you while secretly holding the knife. Alara Whitmore thought she was marrying the love of her life. What she didn't know was that the wedding had been planned, not as a celebration, but as an execution. Every flower, every guest, every carefully timed smile was a piece of a trap designed to destroy her. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Like the video, and let's begin. The Atlantic was angry that morning. Alara stood at the window of her bridal suite on the third floor of Ashbourne Estate and watched the ocean throw itself against the cliffs below like it was trying to warn her about something. The waves didn't crash so much as detonate, white foam exploding against black rock, pulling back, then hitting again, over and over, like something that refused to accept what was happening. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and exhaled. 3 days. 3 days until she became Mrs. Adrian Vale. She should have felt like the luckiest woman alive. That's what the magazine said. That's what the articles said. Quiet museum curator from a working-class family in coastal Maine falls in love with one of the most powerful tech billionaires in the world. A modern fairy tale. A Cinderella story for the digital age. What the articles didn't write about was how Cinderella felt standing alone in a borrowed room, wearing a bathrobe that cost more than her first car, listening to the ocean below sound like it was screaming. She turned away from the window. The vintage gown hung from the wardrobe door like a ghost. Cream-colored silk, not white. She'd been specific about that, with hand-embroidered details along the bodice that her mother had helped her select 3 years ago, before her mother passed. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't designer, it was just hers. The only thing in this entire estate that was genuinely, completely hers. She reached out and touched the sleeve. The silk was cool under her fingers. There was a knock at the door. "Elle?" Serena's voice came through the wood, warm and familiar. "You awake? I've got coffee." Alara let her hand fall. "Yeah, come in." Serena Whitmore pushed the door open with her hip, holding 2 cups of coffee from the estate's private kitchen, wearing silk pajamas that probably cost $400 and looking like she'd already been awake for hours. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes were bright. She smiled that wide, open smile that had been following Alara around since they were teenagers. Yasa, the smile that said, "I'm on your side, always, you and me, nothing else matters." Alara used to find that smile comforting. Now it just made something small and cold turn over in her stomach. She didn't know why. She told herself it was nerves, pre-wedding paranoia. She'd been reading too much into things lately. "You look terrible," Serena said, setting both cups on the vanity table and dropping into the velvet chair like she owned it. "Good morning to you too." "I'm serious, you're pale. Have you slept?" "Some." "Elle," Serena leveled her gaze at her. "You need to stop letting them get to you. Victor and Celeste, they're just noise. They always have been." Alara picked up her coffee and drank without answering. The coffee was excellent. Everything at Ashbourne was excellent. That was part of the problem. The whole place felt like a stage set, polished and perfect and completely hollow underneath. "Did Celeste say something to you last night?" Serena asked. "She said several things." "Such as?" Alara set down the cup. She crossed her arms and looked at the window. "She told me that my dress looked like something from a church rummage sale. She told me that the embroidery was charming in a, quote, rural sort of way. She asked me, very politely, whether I had considered the impact on the Vale family name of being photographed in something that wasn't designed by someone whose name people actually recognized." Serena made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "She's insufferable. She's also Adrian's mother. Adrian doesn't care what she thinks. He cares more than he shows." Alara picked up the coffee again. "Everyone in that family cares more than they show. That's kind of their whole thing." Serena said nothing to that. She just watched Alara over the rim of her own cup with those steady, attentive eyes. And for just a second, one brief, strange second, Alara felt like she was being studied. Not comforted. Studied. The way you study something you need to understand completely before you can use it. Then Serena smiled again, and the feeling passed. "You're going to be fine," Serena said. "I promise." The dress fitting happened the following afternoon in the estate's formal sitting room because everything at Ashbourne happened in rooms with names. The seamstress was a small, precise woman named Margot who had been flown in from New York and who communicated primarily through disappointed exhales. Celeste Vale was present. She had not been invited. She arrived anyway, wearing a dove-gray linen suit and carrying a glass of sparkling water like a weapon, and she positioned herself in the chair nearest the window where the afternoon light was most flattering and where she had the clearest view of everything. Victor did not attend. Victor rarely appeared for anything he considered domestic, but his absence didn't make the room feel safer. Alara stood on the raised platform while Margot made adjustments along the hem, and she kept her eyes on the mirror and her breathing steady. The gown moved perfectly. The light caught the embroidery in a way that made it look less like old silk and more like something worth keeping. "It's sweet," Celeste said from her chair. Alara met her eyes in the mirror. "Thank you." "I said sweet, not impressive." Celeste tilted her head slightly, the way a bird tilts its head before it strikes. "There's a difference." Margot kept working. She gave no sign that she had heard anything. "The Vale wedding will be covered by 14 international publications," Celeste continued. "There will be photographers from 3 different continents. The images will circulate for years. This is not a moment that benefits from sweet." "I like the dress," Alara said. Her voice came out flat. Not angry, just flat, which she had learned was more unsettling than anger. Celeste smiled. It was a beautiful smile, cold as the bottom of a well. "Of course you do, darling. It's yours." She said the word yours the way you'd say amateur. "I simply wonder whether you've considered how it will look, next to Adrian, in the photographs, for posterity." "Celeste," Alara's voice stayed flat. "I'm standing on a platform right now, and a woman is holding pins near my hip. Can we have this conversation later?" "We can." Celeste lifted her water glass. "I just thought you'd want time to consider your options." She reached for the small table beside her to set the glass down, and then the water went everywhere. It happened so fast and so completely that it almost didn't seem real. The glass tilted, struck the edge of the table, or slipped from Celeste's fingers, or something. The story would shift depending on who told it. And the sparkling water arced outward in a pale cascade and landed directly across the front of Alara's gown. Not the hem, not a corner, the center. The embroidered bodice, the silk bodice that her mother had helped her choose 3 years ago, before there was any of this. The silk went dark immediately, spreading. The embroidery threads absorbed the liquid and swelled, and the delicate stitching began to pucker. Margot sucked in a breath. "Oh no, oh no, no." Celeste stood immediately, clutching the empty glass, her expression calibrated to perfect mortification. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. Alara, I'm so sorry. Let me get—" "It's fine," Alara said. Her voice was very quiet. She was staring at the front of her gown in the mirror. The silk was ruined. She knew enough about fabric to know it was ruined. The kind of staining that doesn't come fully out. The kind of warping that doesn't fully reverse. Her mother's dress. The only thing in this estate that was hers. She stood very still and breathed through her nose. "Alara," Celeste began. "I said it's fine." She stepped carefully off the platform and turned away from the mirror. "Margot, I'll need a few minutes." She walked to the far end of the room and stood at the window with her back to both of them and stared at the garden below and said nothing else. Behind her, she heard Celeste apologizing again, saying the right words in the right order with exactly the right amount of regret. It sounded practiced. Alara stood at the window and tried to remember her mother's face and couldn't quite hold the image still. And then the door opened, and Serena walked in. Not like she'd just heard, not like someone who had rushed over when the news reached her. She walked in with the brisk, purposeful energy of someone who had a plan already in motion, and she was carrying something, a large white garment bag, thick and structured, the kind that holds something heavy and expensive. "I just heard," Serena said. She looked at the stained gown on the platform, then at Alara, then back. I'm so sorry. I know how much that dress meant to you." She paused, then held out the garment bag. "I had this I'd been keeping it just in case. You know how I am? I always want to be prepared. I thought maybe. She unzipped the bag. Inside was a gown. Not just any gown. A designer gown, full-length, structured silk and French lace, the kind of dress that arrived in a box from Paris and cost more than some people's houses. It was beautiful. It was stunning, and it fit Alara's measurements perfectly. The right length, the right cut, everything. The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Celeste made a sound of genuine, unguarded delight. "Oh, Serena." She pressed one hand to her chest. "That is perfect. That is exactly right." Margot was already moving to examine it. Guests of the estate who had drifted into the corridor after hearing about the accident began to murmur. Within minutes, the story had traveled the length of the building. Alara's dress was ruined, but her wonderful cousin had saved the wedding. What a gift. What loyalty. What timing. What timing. Alara stood at the window and did not move. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark glass, pale, expressionless, still wearing the wet, ruined gown. Behind her in the reflection, she could see Serena holding the new dress up against the light, while Celeste reached out to touch the fabric with something close to reverence. What timing. A custom gown. Her exact measurements. Heavy with craft and expense, the kind of thing that took weeks to produce. Serena had produced it within minutes of the accident, calm and prepared, as if she had known exactly what would be needed. As if she had known. Alara pressed her fingers against the cold window pane and felt the first real thing she'd felt all day. Not grief about the gown, not humiliation, not anger at Celeste. Fear, small and specific and absolutely certain. She turned around. Serena was still holding the dress up, showing it to Margot, explaining something about the construction with that same bright smile, those same steady eyes. And Alara looked at her cousin, her oldest friend, the woman who had held her hand through her mother's funeral and sat with her through the worst nights of the worst year of her life. And she thought, you knew, you already knew. She didn't say it, she smiled. She crossed the room and touched the new dress and said it was beautiful, which it was, and thanked Serena, which she did, and let Margot get to work, which she allowed. But in the part of her mind that she had learned to listen to, the part that had made her good at her job, the part that knew how to look at something old and damaged and read the truth of what it had been through, something had shifted. The way a lock shifts when the right key finally turns. She was going to find out the truth. She was going to find out what was actually happening inside this estate, inside this family, inside the wedding that was supposed to be the best day of her life. She didn't know yet what she would find, but she knew. Standing in that sitting room in a ruined dress that had been her mother's choice, surrounded by people whose warmth felt increasingly like performance, she knew that whoever she'd been before she walked into Ashbourne Estate, she was going to have to become someone harder before she walked out. She was going to have to become someone who looked at people she loved and asked the questions that could end everything. The ocean outside kept hitting the cliffs. Keep hitting, keep pulling back, keep hitting again. That night, alone in her suite while Adrian attended the rehearsal dinner with his parents, Alara opened her laptop to look for something. She didn't know exactly what. She was a curator by training. She searched by instinct, by the feeling that something was slightly wrong with the surface, that underneath the obvious layer there was another one that told a different story. She went through her emails first, looking for the dress. She checked her own records. Any contact with designers, any measurements sent, any communications between herself and Serena going back 6 months. Nothing. Then she tried something she hadn't tried before. She checked her laptop's backup folder. Adrian had set up her laptop when she moved into his apartment 8 months ago. He was methodical about technology, the way people who built technology tended to be, and he had configured an automatic backup system that pulled from connected devices every 48 hours and stored everything in an encrypted folder she had never needed to access. She found it. She opened it. Most of it was her own files, work documents, research, photo archives from the museum. And then she found a folder she didn't recognize. It was labeled with a date from 11 months ago and a set of letters that meant nothing to her. She opened it expecting her own old files. What she found was someone else's data entirely. Phone records, text threads, screenshots, voice memo transcriptions, data that had somehow been pulled from another device, a device that had connected to her laptop long enough for the backup software to capture it automatically, then been disconnected before anyone thought to check what had been stored. She didn't understand yet what she was looking at. She clicked the first text thread open. The name at the top read Victor Vale, and the messages below were not addressed to Adrian. They were addressed to Serena. Alara sat very still at the small desk in her bridal suite while the ocean outside crashed and pulled and crashed again against the cliffs below. The room was quiet. The estate around her was quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed, and a pair of footsteps passed by without stopping. She read the first message, then the second. Her hand on the trackpad was completely steady, because when you have spent your career learning to look at things that have been buried and deliberately hidden, when you have trained yourself to read damage and deception in things that are very old and very beautiful and very deliberately misleading, you develop a certain stillness in the presence of discovery. Not calm, not peace, something colder and more useful than either of those. She read on, and with every message, the shape of everything that had happened, the gown, the timing, Serena's arrival, Celeste's face, the new dress, the perfect measurements, rearranged itself around a structure she had not been able to see before, a structure that had been there from the beginning, a structure that had her at the center of it, not as a bride, as a target. Her breathing was even. Her face was still. But in the part of her that her mother had always called her deep water part, the part that went quiet before it went fierce, something enormous and irreversible had just happened. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the Atlantic, black and churning below the cliffs. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. The same way she had that morning, the same view, the same ocean, the same woman, but not the same anymore. Not even close. She didn't sleep. Not because she couldn't stop thinking. She could have managed that, had trained herself over years of solitary research to quiet the noise and rest inside uncertainty. She didn't sleep because sleeping felt dangerous. Because somewhere in this estate, behind doors that cost more than her entire apartment back in Maine, people were moving through the dark with plans that had her name written in the center of them, and closing her eyes felt like consent. So she sat in the chair by the window with the cold glass at her back and the laptop on the small table beside her, closed but present, and she let the night pass around her the way water passes around a stone. Still, waiting. Watching the sky above the Atlantic go from black to the particular shade of gray that meant morning was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. When the light was enough, she opened the laptop again. She read every message in that folder a second time. Then a third. Not because she'd missed anything. She hadn't. She was thorough by nature and training, but because the first read had been about understanding what she was seeing, and the second read was about understanding what it meant, and the third read was about making sure she was right. Making sure she wasn't constructing a conspiracy out of grief and loneliness and the particular paranoia that came with marrying into a family that had never wanted you. She wasn't wrong. The messages between Victor Vale and Serena Whitmore spanned 14 months. They began 8 weeks after Alara and Adrian had made their relationship public, cautious at first, careful, coded in a way that suggested Victor had done this kind of thing before. Hired someone. Built a framework. Positioned a person inside someone else's life like a splinter under the skin, invisible until it became unbearable. The early messages were mostly logistics. Money. A number with enough zeros behind it that Alara's chest tightened when she read it. Serena had negotiated. That detail landed somewhere deep and ugly. Not just that she'd accepted the offer, but that she'd pushed back on the initial amount and gotten more. She knew her own worth as a weapon. She priced herself accordingly. The later messages were operational. Serena reporting back. Alara's emotional state, her insecurities. The things Adrian had said to her that she'd told Serena in confidence. The quiet doubt she'd voiced in the dark of her cousin's guest room on the night she felt most like an imposter in Adrian's world. All of it had been transcribed and sent to Victor Vale, cataloged and filed like intelligence reports from behind enemy lines. Alara read her own private grief turned into data points and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sorrow. It was something older and flatter than either, something that sat in the center of her chest like a stone that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. She memorized every relevant message and timestamp. Then she closed the laptop again and went to wash her face. The woman in the bathroom mirror looked like she'd been awake all night because she had been awake all night. And Alara looked at her directly, the way she looked at damaged artifacts, cataloging the wear, acknowledging the damage, deciding what was still structurally sound, what could still hold weight. Enough, she decided. Still enough. She got dressed. She went downstairs. The estate was already moving at 7 in the morning. Catering staff, florists, wedding coordinators with tablets and earpieces, all the machinery of an event that had grown far beyond anything Alara had wanted or planned. She walked through it with her coffee and her quiet and let everyone assume she was just a nervous bride getting air. She needed to find something concrete. The messages told her the shape of the conspiracy, but she needed the substance of it. Victor and Celeste were not just trying to sabotage a marriage. That was the surface layer, the part designed to be found if anyone looked. What sat underneath it was worse, and she needed proof of that worse thing in a form that couldn't be explained away. She needed to get into Victor's office. She spent the morning watching the estate's rhythms, where the staff went, when the family appeared, when Victor's personal assistant, a thin, silent man named Graves who wore the same expression regardless of circumstances, moved between the East Wing and the main building. Victor had commandeered a private study on the ground floor of the East Wing 3 days into their arrival, and he spent the majority of his time there with the door shut and Graves positioned outside it like a piece of furniture. She needed him gone. She needed both of them gone. By 11 in the morning, she had her window. Victor was attending a pre-wedding lunch with a group of his financial associates that Adrian had arranged. A peace offering, she'd thought when Adrian mentioned it, a gesture of respect toward his father's world. Now she understood it differently. Adrian had arranged a room full of powerful men who would notice if Victor left early. Victor would not leave early. Victor would sit in that lunch and perform appropriate patriarchal pride for 3 hours, because Victor cared about appearances the way most people cared about breathing. And Graves went with him, always went with him. Celeste was at the spa with 3 of her friends, which she had announced at breakfast with the specific kind of casual mention that was designed to be overheard and interpreted as relaxation rather than retreat. Serena had texted Alara at 8:15 to say she was running wedding errands in town and would be back by noon. Alara had replied with a thumbs-up emoji and then put her phone face down on the vanity table. She gave herself until 11:45. The East Wing corridor was quiet and carpeted and smelled like old wood and money, the way the oldest parts of old estates tended to smell. She walked through it with her room keycard in her hand and her heart rate elevated and her face arranged in the expression of someone who was simply looking for the garden exit and had taken a wrong turn. She had her story ready. She did that automatically now, had been doing it since she was 7 years old and small, and her aunt had asked her difficult questions about where she'd been, and she had learned that the lie that worked was always the one with a specific, mundane detail. She tried the study door, locked. She'd expected that. She stood for a moment in the corridor with her hands at her sides and breathed through her nose and thought about what she knew of this estate's bones. She'd spent 2 days here before the rest of the family arrived, back when it was just her and Adrian walking through the rooms while the wedding coordinators took measurements. She'd been charmed by the building in spite of herself. It was 18th century, portions of it, and she knew buildings of that age well enough to know that the original layout rarely survived intact. That rooms had been converted and reconverted, that doors existed behind panels. That service corridors ran parallel to formal ones because the original architects had believed that the people who maintained a house should not be visible in it. She walked to the end of the corridor and found the door she was looking for. Low, undecorated, fitted with an old-style lever handle rather than a card reader because it had predated the security renovation. She pressed down on the handle. It opened. The service corridor behind it was narrow and lit by a single strip of utility lighting and smelled like stone and old wiring. She moved through it quickly, counting doors, and found the one that corresponded to the back wall of Victor's study by geometry and memory, and the faint smell of the same expensive cigar smoke that clung to everything in Victor's radius. This door opened too. Because Victor had thought about the corridor door and not thought about the passage behind it, And that was the thing about people who secured themselves behind elaborate locks. They so rarely remembered to look at the walls. She stepped inside. Victor's study was not what she had expected, which was her own fault for expecting anything. She'd been braced for something overtly imposing. Heavy furniture, power signals, the visual grammar of a man who needed you to know he was important. But the room was spare, almost ascetic. A desk, a laptop, a filing system, 3 phones arranged on a charging dock in order of size, 2 chairs that looked like they'd been selected for function rather than comfort. This was a working room, not a performing room. Victor wasn't performing power in here. He was exercising it. She went to the filing system first. Physical files, organized with a precision that bordered on compulsion, labeled in a code that took her about 40 seconds to read because it was a variation on a standard executive notation system, and she had cataloged enough corporate archives in her career to recognize the pattern. She wasn't looking for everything. She was looking for one thing. Blackstone Holdings. She found it behind a folder labeled with a construction company name she didn't recognize. The oldest hiding trick, the false front, the boring surface that the eye slides past. The file inside was thin, 8 pages, and what was on those 8 pages made the stone in her chest sink a little deeper. She didn't have her phone, but she'd left it upstairs deliberately because phones logged location data and she couldn't afford that. So she read the pages standing at the filing cabinet, committing what she could to memory with the systematic focus she had developed over a decade of archival work. Dates, account numbers, the names of 3 subsidiary companies that fed into Blackstone Holdings, and from Blackstone Holdings fed directly into accounts within Adrian's company structure. Transfer amounts. Timing. The appointment of a director. Her name. Her name, typed on an official document dated 6 weeks ago, appointing Alara Whitmore as director of Blackstone Holdings with a company registration number and a set of signatures she had never provided. Someone had used her signature. Copied it, probably, from the estate's prenuptial paperwork that she'd signed 3 months ago without reading as carefully as she should have. She stood in Victor's private study with 8 pages of evidence in front of her and felt the full weight of what had been constructed around her settle into place. She put the files back exactly as she'd found them. She stood at the desk for a moment and looked at the 3 phones on the charging dock. On impulse, not plan, impulse, which was sometimes the smarter faculty. She looked at the middle phone, which was unlocked, because Victor had not anticipated anyone being in this room while he was not in it. The most recent call log showed a number she didn't recognize. The most recent text thread was labeled with initials she did recognize. SW. She read the last 3 messages in that thread and then set the phone down and walked back through the way she had come, and she made it back into the main corridor and down the hall to the staircase before she allowed herself to lean against the wall and breathe. 14 seconds. That was all she allowed. Then she straightened up and went upstairs. She needed Adrian. That thought was more complicated than it sounded, because she had spent the last 12 hours assembling evidence of a conspiracy that surrounded her and Adrian's name had not appeared in any of it. But the absence of something was not the same as innocence, and she had been wrong about people she trusted before. And the man she was marrying in 2 days had secrets. She knew he had secrets. She had felt the shape of them in the careful way he sometimes paused before answering questions about his family. She was not walking into a conversation with him blind to that possibility. She was not walking in assuming he was safe. But she also could not carry this alone. She had evidence of financial fraud, identity forgery, and a conspiracy that named her as its intended victim. If she sat on that alone and something went wrong, there would be no one who knew what she knew. No one to say what had really happened if she suddenly became the story instead of the witness. She needed a witness of her own. She found Adrian in the second-floor library, where he went when he needed to think and didn't want to be found by anyone on his team. She had discovered this about him 4 months into their relationship, that he retreated into books not to read them, but to be surrounded by something that asked nothing of him. He was sitting in the corner chair with a glass of water and a book open on his knee that he wasn't reading, and when she pushed the door open, he looked up with the expression she had come to know as his real face, guarded, quiet, something working behind it that he wasn't ready to say yet. "Hey!" He started to rise. "Sit down." She closed the door behind her, pressed her back against it. "I need you to listen to me and not interrupt." He settled back. His eyes tracked her face with that same careful attention he gave to everything. The attention that had made her trust him initially. The attention that now she needed to interrogate. "Okay," he said. She told him. All of it. The backup files, the messages between Victor and Serena, the forged directorship, the Blackstone holding structure, the transfer amounts, the timeline, the plan. She told it to him in the order she had discovered it, which was the clearest way to tell it. And she kept her voice even and her hands still, and she watched his face the entire time, the way she had been trained to watch things. Looking for the tells, the micro-expressions, the involuntary signals that the body gives when it is being caught. She watched him hear it, and what she saw was not the face of a man being caught. What she saw was something worse, in a different way. The face of a man who was not surprised, not by the broad strokes of it. The specific details landed, she could see that, the Blackstone structure and her name on the directorship, those hit him. But the existence of a conspiracy, his parents, their greed, their willingness to burn everything to keep control, that didn't land like news. That landed like confirmation. She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. He set the glass down on the side table with the careful precision of a man managing himself with everything he had. "Adrian." Her voice came out low. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Did you know?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted. "Not all of it," he said. Something in her chest cracked along a seam she hadn't known was there. She pushed off the door and walked to the center of the room because she needed to move, needed the distance, needed to not be standing right next to him while she processed that sentence. What does that mean? What part? I knew they were stealing from the company. His voice was flat and controlled in a way that told her how hard he was working to keep it that way. I've known for about 14 months that money was leaving through channels I couldn't trace. I hired forensic accountants. They found the transfers, but not the structure. Whoever built it was good. Your parents built it. My father built it. My mother, she knows. But he built it. And Serena. A pause. I didn't know about Serena. She looked at him across the room. But you didn't warn me. You let me walk into this estate surrounded by people who were planning to destroy my life, and you said nothing. I didn't have proof. He stood up, and for the first time she heard the edge underneath the control, something that was not quite anger and was not quite guilt, but was the compound of both. The thing that forms when a person has been making a choice they knew was wrong for a long time. I had suspicion and partial data, and if I'd told you, and we'd moved on it, and it hadn't held up, they would have walked, and they would have known we were watching. You needed me to find it myself. She said it before he finished the sentence, and she heard her own voice do something she hadn't expected. It didn't rise. It dropped. Into a register she didn't often use. You needed it to come from me so it would be clean, so no one could say you'd planted it or constructed it. You needed a witness who didn't know what she was witnessing. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She stood in the middle of his library and breathed and looked at the man she was marrying in 2 days and tried to locate the version of herself who had believed, absolutely and without caveat, that this was safe, that he was the one safe thing. You should have told me, she said. Yes. No hesitation, no qualification. Yes, I should have. I could have been arrested. If this had moved forward the way they planned, if we'd gotten married and then the fraud surfaced and my name was on those documents, I could have been charged with federal crimes for something your parents designed. I know. Say it like you actually understand what that means. He was quiet for a long moment, then, they would have taken everything from you, your career, your freedom, your name. And I knew there was a risk of something like that happening, and I kept you here anyway because I thought I could control when things broke open. I thought I had more time to find the rest of it before it became dangerous for you. He stopped. The control slipped just slightly at the edges. I was wrong about the timing. She turned away from him, walked to the window. Outside the estate grounds spread toward the cliffs, perfectly maintained, the kind of green that only existed because someone was paid to make it exist. What do you want to do? His voice came from behind her, careful, not assuming. I don't know yet. We could take what you found to the authorities now, go around the wedding entirely, get you out of this. If we do that, they'll know immediately. She was thinking out loud, the way she thought when she was working a problem, when she was standing in a storage room with a painting that didn't match its provenance, and she needed to read everything at once. Victor will move the money, he'll have contingencies, he'll have lawyers at the door before we finish the first call. And Serena will disappear somewhere and we won't be able to prove the full scope of it. We'll have pieces, not everything. What are you suggesting? She turned around. She looked at him, fully. The way she hadn't let herself look at him since she'd opened that backup folder, because looking at him fully had felt dangerous, had felt like something she couldn't afford while she was trying to think clearly. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had run out of the ability to make it look light. She hadn't stopped loving him. She hadn't stopped being angry. Both of those things were equally true, which was the most adult and the most infuriating thing about being in love with a real person rather than a version of one. I'm suggesting, she said slowly, that we don't cancel the wedding. He was very still. I'm suggesting we let it happen. All of it. Exactly as they planned. She paused. Except for the part where we lose. She watched him understand what she was saying, watched it move through him. The risk calculation, the instinctive objection, and then underneath both of those, something that looked like the first clean breath he'd taken in a long time. You'd be walking back into the middle of it, he said, knowing everything, performing everything. For 2 more days at every dinner and every pre-wedding event, with Serena and my parents, I know what I'd be walking into. It's not... I know what I'm walking into, Adrian. Her voice was still low, still flat, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before, something that had been sitting behind the glass of that quiet, careful exterior all her life, waiting for a situation bad enough to require it. I've been walking into rooms where people underestimated me my entire life. I know how to do it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, what do you need from me? Everything you have, every piece of evidence you've gathered in 14 months, every account number, every forensic report, every transfer record, all of it. It's not enough on its own. It will be, combined with what I found. She moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back one more time. And Adrian, yeah, when this is over, when all of it is done, we're going to have a very long conversation about what it means to protect someone by hiding the truth from them. And you're going to listen, the whole time. Something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite sorrow, but was in the same family as both. Yeah, he said again. I know. She left him in the library and walked back down the corridor with her shoulders straight and her jaw set and the full impossible weight of what she had just agreed to distributed across her body like a suit of armor she had never worn before but understood, bone deep, how to carry. Behind her, somewhere in the east wing, a door opened and closed. And then she heard footsteps, measured, unhurried, coming from the direction of the main stairs. She turned the corner and nearly walked directly into Serena, who was standing at the junction of 2 hallways with a tote bag over her shoulder and a coffee cup in her hand and that smile already arranged on her face, wide and warm, and the most precisely engineered expression Alara had ever seen. There you are, Serena said. I've been looking everywhere. We need to go over the seating arrangement for the rehearsal dinner. Celeste is trying to move your family to the back tables, and I told the coordinator absolutely not. But you need to come and... Serena. Alara's voice came out perfectly normal. Slightly tired, slightly distracted, the exact voice of a woman dealing with too many wedding details and not enough sleep. Give me an hour, okay? I need to lie down. Serena's eyes moved over her face with that studying quality that Alara now recognized for what it was. Not concern, but assessment, calibration, the involuntary habit of a person checking whether her subject was still performing as expected. Whatever Serena saw, she appeared to find satisfactory. Of course, she squeezed Alara's arm. Her fingers were warm. Rest. I'll handle Celeste. She moved past her down the corridor. Alara kept walking, kept her pace even, kept her face still. She turned the corner and stopped and pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds and felt the full force of what had just happened move through her like a current. She had just stood 18 inches from the woman who had spent over a year methodically dismantling her life. And she had smiled, and she had sounded normal, and she had given nothing away. She could do this. She had to. Because 2 days from now, in front of the most powerful people in the world, everything was going to break open at once. And the only question was whether she would be the one holding the evidence when it did, or whether she would be buried under it. She opened her eyes. She pushed off the wall. And she walked back toward her room with the particular kind of calm that doesn't come from having nothing to fear, but from having decided completely and without reservation that fear was no longer the point. She had 48 hours. That was what she told herself walking back to her room. 48 hours to hold the performance together, to move through rehearsal dinners and family photographs, and the 1,000 small interactions that surrounded a wedding like this one, and to do all of it while carrying the weight of what she knew without letting it show on her face for even a second. She had done harder things. She reminded herself of that. She had stood in front of a room full of academic colleagues at 26 years old and defended a research conclusion that contradicted every established expert in the field, and she had not flinched. She had sat with her mother through the last weeks of her illness and kept her voice steady and her hands gentle when everything inside her was coming apart. She had walked into Adrian Vale's world, the money, the power, the rooms full of people who looked at her and saw an anomaly. And she had not apologized for existing in any of it. She could hold a performance together for 48 hours. She believed that, right up until the moment the performance was taken from her. It happened at the rehearsal dinner. The estate's formal dining room had been arranged for 43 people, so the wedding party, immediate family, the select tier of friends and associates who occupied the inner circle of the Vale's social world. The table was long and white, and covered in flowers that cost more per arrangement than Alara made in a week at the museum. And the lighting was the kind of warm amber that made everyone look better than they were, which she was beginning to understand was a Vale family aesthetic principle rather than just a decorating choice. She wore the blue dress she'd brought from home. Not the estate wardrobe, not something Serena had suggested, not anything that had been near this family's hands. She sat in her assigned seat and drank water and talked to the people on either side of her with the same focused politeness she'd been deploying all her life in rooms where she didn't quite belong, and she watched. She watched Serena, 3 seats down, laughing at something one of Adrian's associates had said, her head tilted back, her throat exposed. The performance of ease and warmth so complete and so practiced that Alara could no longer find the seam where person ended and character began. That was the thing that kept hitting her in unexpected moments. Not the betrayal itself, but the duration of it. Over a year of that face. Over a year of that laugh. Alara had held that face against her chest and cried into it when she thought she wasn't good enough for Adrian's world, and the face had stroked her hair and said the right things and stored everything for later delivery to Victor Vale. She looked away from Serena. She found Victor at the head of the table, which was not his place. It was Adrian's table, Adrian's rehearsal dinner, but Victor had positioned himself at the head with the unthinking confidence of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy whatever space he chose. He was talking to 2 men Alara didn't recognize, both of them with the specific quality of stillness that suggested they were listening in a professional capacity, not friends. Something else. Lawyers, she thought. Or something adjacent to lawyers. Men who got paid to be in the room when things went wrong. Something moved in her stomach, cold and specific. Why would Victor need that kind of men here tonight? She reached for her water glass and drank and thought about that. Adrian was at the other end of the table, and he caught her eye once during the first course and held it for a moment that communicated everything they couldn't say out loud, and she gave him the smallest nod she could manage and looked away before anyone could read the exchange. They had agreed. No visible communication that differed from normal. Nothing that suggested they were aligned in a way that differed from the standard alignment of a couple about to get married. Victor was a detail man. Victor would notice. Celeste was beside Victor, wearing something architectural in dove gray, and she was performing warmth tonight in a way that she didn't bother with in smaller settings. Here, with an audience, she touched Alara's shoulder as she passed and said how beautiful she looked, and how excited she was to welcome her into the family. And her hand was warm and her eyes were cold, and Ilara smiled back with every muscle in her face cooperating and said, "Thank you, Celeste. I'm so happy to be here." The first course became the second course. Ilara watched the two unknown men at Victor's end of the table and tried to work out what they were for. They ate little. They talked quietly, to Victor and to each other, and once one of them took out a phone and showed Victor something on the screen that made Victor's jaw tighten in a way she could read from 15 feet away. Something was moving. Something she hadn't accounted for. She was still trying to work out what when the dinner ended and the group dispersed into the adjoining reception room for after-dinner drinks. And Celeste appeared at her elbow with a glass of champagne and a smile like a freshly sharpened blade. "Walk with me a moment," Celeste said. Not a request. Ilara took the champagne she didn't intend to drink and walked. Celeste led her to the far end of the reception room, near the doors to the terrace, where the ambient sound of 40 people talking created enough cover for a private conversation. She stopped with her back to the room and looked at Ilara with the warm amber light doing nothing for her expression. "You seem distracted tonight," Celeste said. "Pre-wedding nerves." Ilara's voice was easy. Celeste turned her champagne glass slowly in her fingers. "You know, I've been thinking about what you must have felt, finding your dress ruined like that. It was clumsy of me. I want you to know I feel genuinely terrible about it." "I know you do." A pause. The glass kept turning. "The new gown is more appropriate, I think, for the occasion." "It's beautiful." "Yes." Another pause. Celeste looked at her with those pale, calibrating eyes. "You're handling everything very well. The change of plans, the family pressure. You're more resilient than I expected." Ilara looked back at her and let the compliment sit between them without touching it. "I've underestimated you," Celeste said, almost conversational, almost honest. "I want you to know that I recognize that." Something about the sentence landed wrong, the tense of it. Not, "I have underestimated you. I've underestimated you." Present perfect, the tense of something that has just completed. Past tense with current relevance, as if the underestimating had just ended, as if something had changed. "That's generous," Ilara said. Celeste smiled, set her champagne down on the nearby tray with a precise click. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." She walked back toward the group. Ilara stood at the edge of the terrace doors and breathed through her nose and tried to locate what had just happened. It had felt like a message, but she couldn't read it. Couldn't tell whether it was a threat, a warning, a test, or something else entirely. She looked for Adrian across the room. He was talking to the two unknown men. Victor was watching the exchange. Ilara set down her own untouched champagne and walked in that direction, not fast, not direct, curving through the room in a way that would bring her close enough to hear without appearing to approach. She stopped near a cluster of guests and accepted a comment from someone about the weather tomorrow, and half listened and kept her peripheral attention on Adrian and the two men. She caught fragments. "Enough." The words forensic audit surfaced, then the words board notification, then a phrase that didn't make sense to her for a moment, protective removal. And then it did make sense, and the cold thing in her stomach got heavier. Protective removal was a legal mechanism. It allowed a company's board to remove an executive officer from their position pending investigation of financial irregularities. It was designed to protect the company from liability during the investigation period. It was also, she understood with sudden terrible clarity, exactly the mechanism you would use if you wanted to remove someone from their own company before they could take action against you. Victor wasn't waiting for the wedding. He was moving tonight. She turned away from the cluster of guests and walked toward the corridor with her pulse elevated and her face still and her mind running the arithmetic at high speed. They had assumed, she and Adrian had assumed, that Victor and Celeste's plan culminated at the wedding reception. That the exposure of the fraud and the framing of Ilara was timed to the ceremony, designed for maximum public impact. That they had 48 hours. They had miscalculated. Victor had read something, or found something, or someone had told him something, one of the three. And whatever it was, it had accelerated his timeline. He was not waiting for the wedding. He was filing for the protective removal tonight, which meant that by morning, Adrian would be legally suspended from his own company pending an investigation that had Alara's forged name attached to it, and the narrative would already be established before she had a chance to counter it. She found Adrian breaking away from the two men and moving toward the corridor, and she intersected him at the doorway with her hand on his arm and said quietly, into the 2 inches of space between their faces, "They're moving tonight." She felt him go still under her hand. "The 2 men," she said, "lawyers or board officers. They're filing for your removal tonight. Forensic audit and protective removal. Victor's not waiting for the wedding." Adrian's face did the things she had watched it do twice now. The brief total stillness that preceded a recalibration. Then, "How close is he to filing?" "I don't know. Tonight." The conversation was happening now. He looked past her toward the room. She could see him calculating, the same way she calculated, running variables and timelines and probable outcomes. Then something moved across his face that was not good. "My evidence," he said. "The forensic reports." "What about them?" "I keep them on a secured server, external, not connected to any company network." He paused. "Graves has the access credentials. He's been with my father for 20 years. She stared at him. "I didn't think—" He stopped. The discipline in his face held, but only barely. "I rotated the credentials 6 months ago. I thought that was enough. But if my father has been watching the access logs— Adrian," her voice was very quiet, "does your father have your evidence?" The pause lasted 2 seconds. "He might," Adrian said. "He might have had access for weeks." The ground shifted under her in a way that had nothing to do with the floor. If Victor had the forensic reports, he didn't just have a head start. He had their entire strategy. He knew what evidence they were holding. He knew its scope, its gaps, its strength. He had been watching them build their case against him and had planned his countermove accordingly. And the countermove was already in motion in the next room. She thought about Celeste on the terrace. The smile. "I've underestimated you," past tense, the thing that had just finished. She hadn't been receiving a warning. She'd been receiving a goodbye. "We have to move now," Alara said. "We're not ready. We don't have a choice." "Alara, if we go at them tonight without the full package, without witnesses in the right position, if we wait until morning, you won't have a company to fight for." She said it evenly, without cruelty, because it wasn't cruelty. It was just the shape of the situation, undecorated. "Is there anything they don't have? Any piece of evidence that wasn't on that server?" He thought. She watched him think, watched him move through the architecture of what he'd built over 14 months and find the gaps. "The Blackstone directorship document," he said. "They don't know you found that. It wasn't on the server. You found the physical file." "I have it memorized, every number." "That's not enough." "Memorized data. The original is still in Victor's filing cabinet," she said. "I put it back where I found it. If we can get back into that room and photograph it, Graves will be back. The office will be— Adrian." She cut him off, not unkindly. "Stop telling me what won't work and tell me what we have." He looked at her. In the amber light from the reception room, with 43 people making polished conversation 20 feet away, and his father in the process of dismantling his life with legal mechanisms, Adrian Vale looked for the first time since she had known him, genuinely afraid. Not of Victor. She understood that with sudden clarity. He had lived with the fear of Victor for decades. That was not new. He was afraid of failing her. "I have a copy," he said. "The forensic reports. There's a physical copy. I made it 14 months ago, before I moved everything to the server. Old habit, something my first lawyer taught me. Always keep one physical set off-site." He paused. "It's here. I brought it to the estate. It's in my room." "Then we need to get it." "And then what? We walk back into that room and—" "No." She shook her head. "We don't improvise this. We can't. If we go at them without a structure, without the right people in the room, they'll spin it. Victor will control the narrative before we finish the first sentence." She breathed, thought. The gears moving fast now, the way they moved when she was standing in front of something that needed to be understood quickly because it was fragile and time was already working against her. "Who's in that room right now that we can trust?" He considered. "James Hartwell. He's known me for 15 years. He's independent of my parents' network." "Who else?" "Margaret Chen. She was on the original company board before my father restructured it. She's had her own suspicions about the finances for years. That's two. Elara, we're talking about going to them tonight, in the middle of a rehearsal dinner without preparation. I know what we're talking about. She straightened. Her spine settled into something that felt like resolution. Not the comfortable kind, the other kind. The kind that forms when you have run out of options, and what remains is not choice, but will. Go get the documents. Don't go through the main hall. Use the east corridor. I'll find Hartwell and Chen and I'll get them into the library. Give me 20 minutes. And if Victor moves before 20 minutes, then we deal with that. But we move. Right now. We move or we lose. He looked at her for one more second. Then he nodded, once, and turned toward the east corridor, and she turned back toward the reception room. She found James Hartwell near the bar, a solid man in his 60s with the straightforward quality of someone who had survived a long career without becoming interesting about it, which in this world was its own form of integrity. She touched his arm and said she needed 5 minutes of his time on a private matter, and watched him read her face and agree without asking questions, which told her everything she needed to know about his instincts. She found Margaret Chen by the windows, which was where she'd been all evening, slightly apart from the main group in the way of someone who was present out of obligation rather than enjoyment. Margaret was 61 and carried herself like someone who had been underestimated professionally for decades and had arrived at a specific relationship with that experience. She had stopped being angry about it and started using it. Elara recognized the posture. She crossed to her and said the same thing she'd said to Hartwell, and Margaret looked at her with sharp, dark eyes and said, "About the company finances?" Elara kept her face neutral. "About several things." "All right," Margaret said, and set down her drink. Elara moved them both toward the library, separately, casually, with the timing of someone who had been planning parties for years rather than someone improvising a counteroffensive in real time. She got them into the library and pulled the door closed and turned to face them. "I need you both to listen to me," she said, "and I need you to tell me now, before I say anything else, whether there is any reason either of you would protect Victor Vale's interests over the company's." Hartwell blinked. Margaret did not blink. "No," Hartwell said. "Not for 20 years, Margaret said. Elara nodded. "Then here's what's happening." She told them. Concise, structured, the way she'd told Adrian but compressed, stripped to the operational essentials. Financial fraud, Blackstone Holdings, the forged directorship, the protective removal being filed tonight. As she spoke, she watched their faces, and what she saw on Hartwell's was escalating alarm, and what she saw on Margaret's was something that looked almost like grim vindication, the face of a person who has been right about something terrible for a long time and is exhausted by being proven correct. "The protective removal," Margaret said when Elara paused. "If it's filed tonight, it needs a minimum of 3 board signatures. Victor has 2 reliable votes, Pemberton and Walsh," Hartwell said. "Yes, he needs 1 more." Margaret's jaw was set. "He's been working on Davies for 6 months. If Davies signs—" The door opened. Elara turned. It wasn't Adrian. It was Serena. She stood in the doorway in her rehearsal dinner dress, with her tote bag gone, and her hair still perfect and that wide, warm smile already in place, and her eyes moved across the room. Elara, Hartwell, Margaret, the 3 of them standing in a library with the door closed. And the smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Something behind it understood exactly what it was looking at. The silence lasted 1 second, 2, 3. Then Serena said, still smiling, "There you all are. Elara, Celeste is asking for you. Something about the seating chart for tomorrow." Her eyes stayed on Elara's face. She seemed urgent. The room held its breath. Elara looked at Serena, at the smile, at the eyes behind the smile, and she understood that Serena had not wandered in. Serena had followed her. Probably had been following her since the hallway, since the moment in the reception room when Elara had turned toward the corridor with her pulse elevated and her face still and thought she had managed it well enough. Not well enough. Serena had seen, and Serena had followed, And now Serena was standing in the doorway of the library looking at the three people Elara had just assembled. And in approximately 60 seconds, she was going to excuse herself, still smiling, and walk directly to Victor Vale. "Thank you, Serena," Elara said. Her voice came out absolutely steady. "I'll be right there." Serena's eyes held hers for one beat longer than was natural. Then she nodded, still smiling, and pulled the door closed. Elara turned back to Hartwell and Margaret. "We have less than 5 minutes," she said. And Hartwell said, "5 minutes for what?" And Margaret said nothing, just looked at Elara with those sharp, dark eyes. And Elara felt the full impossible weight of the next 30 seconds land across her shoulders like something she had been walking toward her entire life without knowing it. Because in 5 minutes, Serena would reach Victor. Victor would know the people in this room. Victor would accelerate the filing. Adrian was still in the East Corridor retrieving documents that might already be insufficient. The two unknown lawyers were in the next room. Margaret had just told her Victor needed one more board signature and Davies had been cultivated for 6 months. And they were all in the same building tonight, all in the same estate, all within reach of each other and of every mechanism that was about to be deployed. There was no version of 48 hours left. There was no version of a careful plan executed with full preparation. There was only right now, this room, these two people, and whatever Elara could build from what she had in her hands at this moment, memory and nerve, and the particular ferocity that forms in a person who has been set up to fall and has decided, with everything that is left in her, that she will not. She opened her mouth to speak, and then she heard footsteps in the corridor, quick and deliberate. And the door opened again, and this time it was Adrian, and his face was the color of old ash, and he was carrying a folder in one hand and his phone in the other. And he looked at her across the room with an expression she had never seen on him before. An expression that said something had happened that was worse than what they had planned for. "It's already filed," he said. The room went very still. 20 minutes ago," he said. "Davies signed. The protective removal is on record. As of tonight, I am suspended from operational control of my own company pending a financial investigation." He paused, the folder in his hand. "And Elara, they've named you, formally, as the subject of a parallel investigation into the activities of Blackstone Holdings." She felt the sentence hit her in the center of the chest, not like a shock, like a confirmation of something she had known was coming and had not quite believed until this moment. She was no longer just a target. She was a named suspect in a federal financial investigation. She was no longer the person building the case. She was the case. The room held the silence, and she stood inside it and felt the full architecture of Victor Vale's plan settle around her like a structure that had been built over 14 months, with patience and precision and total contempt for her. And she understood that she had 2 choices left, and only 2, and both of them required her to become someone she had never had to be before. She could run, leave, walk out of this estate and find a lawyer and fight it from the outside with whatever she had, and maybe survive it, and definitely lose everything in the process. Or she could stay. She could walk back into that reception room with 43 witnesses and whatever documents Adrian was holding and the testimony of 2 people who had agreed to listen, and she could burn it all down tonight, in front of everyone, with no preparation and no safety net and no guarantee that any of it would hold. She looked at Adrian, at the folder, at his face. She looked at Hartwell and Margaret. She breathed in through her nose. And she said, in a voice she did not recognize as entirely her own because it was steadier and colder and more certain than anything she had produced before, the only sentence that was left to say. "Then we go now." She walked back into that reception room like she owned it, not because she felt that way. Her heart was hitting her ribs with the specific violence of a body that understood the danger even when the mind was trying to override it, and her hands were cold, and somewhere in the back of her throat there was a taste like copper and adrenaline that she recognized from the one time in her life she had been in a car accident. That suspended, crystalline moment between impact and consequence when everything slows down and becomes very precise and very terrible. She felt all of that. She walked in anyway. The reception room was still moving, 43 people with drinks and conversations, and the warm, amber hum of an event that had not yet been informed it was about to end. Caterers moved through the periphery. Someone was laughing near the fireplace. The two lawyers she had clocked earlier were still at Victor's end of the room, but their posture had changed. They were no longer consulting. They were waiting. Victor saw her come in. She watched him see her and watched his face do nothing, which was the tell. The absolute controlled blankness of a man who had just filed legal documents with her name on them and was now watching her walk back into his sightline with 3 other people behind her. A man with a clear conscience would have registered something. Mild curiosity, perhaps. Victor registered nothing, which meant he was managing what he knew, and what he knew was a great deal. Celeste was beside him. Her champagne was fresh. She glanced at Alara and looked away. Serena was across the room, near the bar, with her phone in her hand and her thumb moving, texting. Alara didn't need to guess who. Alara stopped in the center of the room. She didn't reach for a microphone. There wasn't one. She didn't need one. The room wasn't that large, and the particular quality of her stopping, the deliberateness of it, the way she stood without moving in the center of all that ambient sound, started pulling attention the way stillness always pulled attention in a room full of motion. Heads turned, conversations thinned, the laughter near the fireplace guttered out. "I need everyone's attention," she said. Her voice came out clear, not loud. Clear, which carried further than loud in a room with good acoustics. And Ashbourne's reception room had excellent acoustics, because the family that built it 3 centuries ago had understood that the rooms where power was exercised needed to be heard in. Victor moved. Not toward her, laterally, a single step that repositioned him closer to the 2 lawyers, and she clocked it and kept going. "I know this isn't traditional," she said. The room had gone mostly quiet now, the remaining conversations dropping as people registered the specific quality of what was happening. Not a toast, not an announcement, something with edges. "I know the rehearsal dinner isn't usually the moment for this kind of conversation, but it turns out we don't have until tomorrow." "Alara," Adrian's voice from behind her, steady and present, not stopping her, marking himself beside her. The room heard it. "Something happened tonight that the people in this room have a right to know about," she said. "Particularly those of you who have professional relationships with Veil Technologies." Victor said, "That's enough." His voice was not loud either. It was the voice of a man who had spent 60 years learning that he didn't need to be loud to be heard, and under other circumstances it would have worked. The room would have flinched and recalibrated and deferred to the authority in it. The room shifted. But Alara didn't stop. "Victor Vale filed a legal petition tonight," she said. "A protective removal order that suspends Adrian from operational control of his own company. The petition cites financial irregularities." She paused. "The financial irregularities are real, but they didn't originate with Adrian." "Security." Victor's voice clipped now, directed at the door. One of the estate staff near the entrance moved uncertainly, not trained for this, not sure what he was being asked to do. "I have the documents," Alara said. "The actual documents. Not copies, not summaries. The physical records of a fraudulent corporate entity called Blackstone Holdings, which has been used for 14 months to funnel money out of Veil Technologies through a series of subsidiary accounts." She felt her pulse in her temples. Her voice didn't shake. "Those funds were moved by Victor Vale. The Blackstone entity was registered in a jurisdiction specifically chosen to complicate investigation. 6 weeks ago, my name was added to the directorship records without my knowledge or consent, using a forged version of my signature obtained from prenuptial paperwork." The room was silent. Not the polite silence of people listening. The dense, pressurized silence of people who had stopped breathing. "That's a criminal allegation," one of the 2 lawyers said from Victor's side of the room. Smooth, professional, prepared. "Made without evidentiary basis by someone who has just been named in a federal investigation." "She has evidentiary basis," Margaret Chen said. Every head in the room turned. Margaret was standing to Alara's right, and her voice had the particular weight of someone who had been in boardrooms for 30 years and knew exactly how much space her words occupied. "I've seen the transfer records. They're consistent with what she has just described." "Margaret," Victor said. "Don't." Margaret's voice was flat. "Don't use my first name right now, Victor." Hartwell stepped forward on Alara's left. I can confirm the same. Victor's face was still controlled, but something underneath the control was moving, a subterranean pressure, the way stone looks perfectly still right up until the moment it cracks. He looked at Hartwell and Margaret, and then at Alara, and his eyes were the color of deep water, and just as cold, and he said, with the quiet of a man who has decided that quiet is no longer sufficient, "You have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Alara said. "I'm doing what you spent 14 months designing me not to be able to do. I'm standing up in front of witnesses and saying out loud what your documents say on paper. Your name is on those documents. My forged signature is on those documents. There's a difference, and a forensic handwriting analysis will establish it in approximately 48 hours, which means the window in which the forgery is useful to you is closing right now, tonight, in this room." Victor looked at her. For the first time since she had entered his world, she felt the full force of his attention without the social machinery around it. No dinner table, no family performance, no comfortable power differential to stand behind. Just the two of them at the center of a room full of witnesses, and whatever he was underneath, the wealth and the control and the 60 years of getting exactly what he wanted. He was calculating. She could see it. Running the variables the same way she ran them, the same way Adrian ran them, and she thought, that's where Adrian gets it from. That computational quality. The capacity to be inside a crisis and still be processing it like a problem with a solution. Adrian had inherited that from his father and turned it toward different ends. And right now, both of them were running the same numbers from opposite sides of the room. Victor reached a conclusion first. He turned to the lawyers. "File the injunction, now." Then to the room, with the smooth authority of a man pulling on a last reserve. "This young woman is under federal investigation. Anything she says tonight is tainted by that context. I would encourage everyone present to..." Adrian crossed the room. Not fast, not aggressive, but with the kind of absolute purposeful momentum that parted the crowd without requiring anyone to be moved. People simply stepped aside because something in his movement told them to, and he walked to the center of the room, and he stopped beside Alara, and he turned to face his father. The room went a register quieter than it had been, which should not have been possible, but was. Father and son, 12 feet apart. The full length of whatever had existed between them for Adrian's entire life compressed into the distance between them now, and everyone in the room felt the charge of it without being able to name it. "Don't do this, Adrian," Victor said. Quiet. Just for him. Except the room heard it anyway. "You did this?" Adrian said. 14 months ago. You started it. I'm finishing it." "I built everything you have." "You built a company." Adrian's voice was controlled, but the control had a different quality now. Not the discipline of suppression, but the steadiness of someone who has already done the hardest part, and what's left is just saying the words. "I turned it into something worth stealing, and when it became worth more than you expected, you decided you needed it back. You were going to throw it away. On her..." Victor's chin moved fractionally toward Alara, a gesture so small and so contemptuous that half the room missed it. "On a woman with no background, no connections, no understanding of what..." "Stop!" Adrian's voice didn't rise. It cut. "Don't finish that sentence." Victor finished it anyway. "No understanding of what this family requires," he said. "What it costs. What it demands. She was always going to be a liability, Adrian. I was protecting the legacy." "You were protecting the theft," Adrian said. The word landed in his room like something dropped from a height. Victor's jaw tightened. "I want her removed from this estate. Tonight." "This is my estate," Adrian said. "I booked it. I paid for it. You are a guest." Something passed through Victor's face that was not quite emotion, but was the shadow of it. The place where emotion would have been if it hadn't been suppressed for so long that the pathways had calcified. He looked at his son across 12 feet, and whatever he found there was not what he had expected to find. And Alara watched him recalibrate, and watched him decide, and watched him land on the choice that she had been afraid he would land on from the beginning. He stopped managing. He attacked. "You want to know what she is?" Victor's voice rose for the first time, not to a shout, but to a projection, carrying to the edges of the room. "She's an opportunist. She is a woman with a forged signature on corporate documents, A woman who broke into my private office. He paused, watching Alara's face for the impact. Yes, I know about that. The service corridor has been fitted with cameras for 2 years, Alara. Did you think that room was unsecured? A woman who has spent the past 24 hours constructing a counter-narrative because she knows what the financial investigation is going to find. The room shifted. She felt it. The way a room shifts when a narrative gains traction, when the first version of a story is challenged by a louder second version, and people who don't know either party begin to calibrate toward whoever sounds most certain. Her chest was tight, her hands were cold, the copper taste in her throat was sharper. She had been recorded. In the service corridor, in Victor's office. She ran the implications at speed. Camera footage of her in Victor's private office without authorization, combined with her name on the Blackstone documents, combined with the federal investigation already on record. Victor's lawyers could build a structure around that footage in a matter of hours that would require months to dismantle. And in those months, the narrative would be set. And narratives, once set, were geological. They took enormous force to move and usually left damage regardless. She felt the plan she had walked into this room with start to bend under the weight of what she hadn't known. Then Adrian said, "Show them." She looked at him. He was looking at the folder in his own hands, the physical copies of the forensic reports, 14 months of financial reconstruction, account numbers and transfer records, and the documented architecture of a theft that had been built one careful layer at a time. He opened the folder and he walked to the nearest table and he spread the pages across the white tablecloth among the empty glasses and dessert plates. "Come and look," he said to the room. "Anyone who wants to. Come and look at the account numbers. Compare them to what you know of the company's legitimate structure. If you've had any professional involvement with Veil Technologies in the past 3 years, you will recognize some of these transfers, and you will recognize that they don't match any legitimate operational expense." Hartwell moved first. Then 2 of the financial associates who had been at Victor's end of the table, men who had their own investments tied to the company, men who had their own reasons to want to know the truth, who now stood over the spread documents with the focused attention of people reading something that directly affected their money. Money, Alara had learned, was a more reliable motivator than justice. "That's inadmissible," one of Victor's lawyers began. "In court, possibly," Margaret said. "In this room, tonight, in front of every major investor and board-adjacent figure in this company's network, it's very admissible." She looked at the lawyer with the steady gaze of someone who had outlasted better men than him. And what happens in rooms like this one, in conversations like this one, determines what gets investigated formally and by whom. I think you know that. Victor turned to Celeste. It was an involuntary movement, small, almost invisible, the reflex of a man who had made every significant decision in the presence of the same person for 40 years. Celeste was standing very still with her champagne held in both hands, and her face arranged in an expression that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but existed in the space between them. And when Victor looked at her, she looked back, and something passed between them that was entirely private and entirely legible and entirely too late. Serena was at the edge of the room. Alara turned to look at her. Serena had stopped texting. Her phone was at her side and her face had lost the performance. Not gradually, not in stages, but all at once. The way a signal drops, the warmth and the brightness and the curated openness simply gone, replaced by something underneath that was tired and calculating and smaller than the person Alara had believed she was for the past decade. Their eyes met. Alara held it. She had planned to say something to Serena here, had rehearsed the shape of it in the brief, high-pressure planning she'd done in the library before walking out. She'd planned something precise and devastating, something that laid out the 14 months of messages and the negotiated payment and the specific acts of sabotage in language that the room would understand and remember. She said none of it. Because looking at Serena now, with the performance stripped away, she could see something she hadn't expected to see and hadn't budgeted for. Serena looked exhausted. Not guilty, not remorseful. Those would come later, maybe, or maybe not. But exhausted in the specific way of a person who has been maintaining a very complicated lie for a very long time and is running out of the energy to continue and is simultaneously too far in to stop. Whatever Serena had been before Victor Vale found her and made her an offer, that person was not entirely gone. just buried under 14 months of choices that had compounded into something she could no longer climb out of. Alara did not forgive her. She also did not perform the confrontation she'd planned. She simply held Serena's eyes for 5 seconds and then turned back to the room. The board petition that was filed tonight, Alara said, her voice finding that clear register again, requires a minimum of 3 signatures. Victor has 2 reliable votes and obtained a third tonight under circumstances I'd ask Mr. Davies to reflect on carefully. She found Davies in the room, a compact man in his 50s who had gone the color of old paper. The documentation in front of you represents evidence that will be presented to the appropriate regulatory authorities beginning tomorrow morning. That process is already initiated. She paused. Anyone who has signed documents on behalf of this petition in the past 6 hours may want to speak with independent legal counsel before that process completes. Davies said, He told me it was a compliance matter, a routine. It's not routine, Margaret said crisply. And you know it wasn't. You've been cultivated for 6 months, Robert. Don't compound it. Davies looked at Victor. Victor was looking at the documents spread across the table, where 4 financial associates were now clustered, one of them with his own phone out photographing pages, and the expression on Victor's face was the closest thing to unguarded she had ever seen on it. A man watching the structure he has built for 14 months be dismantled in a room he controlled an hour ago, by a woman he had designed as a scapegoat, while his son stood beside her and his allies reconsidered, and the lawyers he'd brought began exchanging glances that had nothing to do with defending him. Celeste set her champagne down. The small sound of the glass on the table was the loudest thing in the room. "Victor," she said. Her voice was very quiet. He didn't look at her. "Victor." Louder this time. Something in it that Alara had not heard in any of Celeste's careful, performing tones. Something raw and frightened and real. "This is enough." "Don't." "It's enough." Celeste's voice broke on the second word, a clean fracture, and then steadied. "We're done." The room was absolutely still. Victor turned to look at his wife. Whatever passed between them in that moment was theirs, and Alara looked away from it, not out of respect, but because it was not the thing that mattered now. And there were still things that mattered. There were still variables in motion, and the lawyers were still in the room, and the petition was still filed, and none of what had happened in this room constituted a legal resolution of anything. What it constituted was a public record. 43 witnesses, multiple phones already out. She could see them, people documenting, people sending, the information already leaving this room at the speed of modern communication, spreading into the networks that connected every person present to every person they knew in the financial and legal and media worlds. Victor could not unfile the petition, but the petition would now be investigated in the context of what had happened in this room tonight, and that context changed everything. It wasn't over. But the terms had changed. She felt Adrian's hand find hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not something for the room, just his fingers closing over hers at their sides, where most people couldn't see it, and she felt the warmth of it move up her arm, and she held it. "I need water," she said quietly, to no one in particular, because suddenly the adrenaline that had been holding her upright for the past 2 hours was making a negotiated exit from her body, and her knees were doing something that she needed to address privately and immediately. Adrian's hand tightened on hers. "I've got you," he said. Not romantically, practically. The way you say it to someone who has just done something that required everything and is now running on the other side of it. She nodded, kept standing. Across the room, one of Victor's lawyers was speaking quietly into his phone. The other was gathering papers. Victor had not moved from his position, but the quality of his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of someone controlling a room. It was the stillness of someone waiting to understand what the room was going to do next. And then Serena moved. Not toward Alara, not toward Victor. She moved toward the door, her phone in her hand, her bag over her shoulder, with the quick, quiet efficiency of someone who had identified an exit and was taking it while the room's attention was elsewhere. She almost made it. "Serena!" Alara's voice from across the room. Serena stopped with her hand on the door frame. She didn't turn around immediately. A breath. 2. Then she turned. Her face was the face Alara had known for 10 years, but empty now, the way a room looks empty when the furniture has been removed. You could still see where everything used to be, the outlines, the shapes, the ghost of something that had occupied the space. It was the most honest Alara had ever seen her look, and it was the saddest. "Don't run," Alara said. "There's no version of this where running helps you." A long pause. Serena's jaw moved. She said, "I didn't want," and stopped. "I know," Alara said. She didn't know, actually. Didn't know what Serena had wanted or hadn't wanted, or what story she had told herself to make 14 months of this bearable, and she was not prepared to grant the comfort of being known to someone who had spent over a year treating her interior life as a resource to be mined. But she needed Serena in the room. She needed her not to run. And so she said, "I know," which was the thing Serena had always needed to hear, and she used it one more time, one last time, not as cruelty, but as necessity. Serena's hand dropped from the door frame. She came back into the room, and the door stayed open. The night air from the corridor moved through it, and with it the distant sound of the ocean below the cliffs. Still hitting, still pulling back, still hitting again. And Alara stood in the center of the ruined rehearsal dinner with her hand in Adrian's hand and her body beginning to understand what she had just demanded of it, and every person in the room watching to see what happened next. What happened next was that Hartwell straightened up from the documents on the table and looked across the room at Margaret and then at Alara, and he said, "I'm calling the regulatory board chair tonight. She needs to hear this before morning." Margaret nodded. "I'll call Davies' counsel." She looked at Davies without inflection. So he understands his options. Davies was already reaching for his own phone. Victor watched his room dismantle itself. The allies redistributing, the lawyers receding, the social architecture of a lifetime's careful construction beginning to come apart at the load-bearing joints, and the sound it made as it went was not dramatic. It was very quiet. The sound of people making different decisions. The sound of loyalty proving contingent. The sound of money remembering which direction it needed to flow. He looked at Alara. She looked back. She expected something, some final attempt, some move she hadn't anticipated. Victor Vale had not gotten to where he was by accepting the room's verdict without a final play, and she kept her weight forward and her attention total, and waited for what he had left. He said nothing. He looked at her. This woman he had hired a proxy to destroy. This woman who had found his documents and memorized his account numbers, and stood in the center of his hand-picked audience and burned his plan down with nothing but nerve and preparation. And he looked at her the way she had seen serious men look at serious opponents when the game was finished, with something that was not respect exactly, but was the reluctant acknowledgement that she had beaten him. And then he looked away. He turned to the door. Celeste followed him. At the threshold, Celeste paused. She turned back, and her eyes found Alara, and her face did something that it had never done in any of their interactions. It moved without performance. Just a woman in her 60s standing at the edge of consequences, looking at the person who had precipitated them, and whatever she was feeling was too complex to name and too late to matter. She left. The door closed behind them. The room exhaled. And Alara stood inside the exhale and felt the full weight of her own body suddenly very present and very heavy, and her hand was shaking slightly inside Adrian's. Just the right hand, not the left. The right hand where the adrenaline had been pooling and was now dispersing. And she thought about her dress, the original dress with the embroidered bodice, the one that had been destroyed in this same building 2 days ago, the one that had been her mother's choice and no one else's. Adrian had said it was restored. She hadn't seen it yet. She hadn't had time to see it. But the thought of it was suddenly the most important thing in the room. Not the documents on the table, or the regulatory calls being made in the corner, or the sound of Serena sitting down in a chair somewhere behind her with the specific quality of a person who has run out of road. The dress. Restored. Still hers. She held on to that. She held on to Adrian's hand, and she stood inside the wreckage of an evening that had begun as a rehearsal for a wedding and ended as something else entirely. Something that had no name yet because it had only just happened, and the naming would come later, when there was time for it. Her heart was still hitting her ribs. Her hands were still cold. The copper taste in the back of her throat had not gone away. But she was standing. She was standing, and the room was changed, and the plan, The 14-month plan built around her as its center, around her name and her silence and her trust and her grief, had collapsed not from the outside but from inside, from within the space where she was supposed to be a victim, and no version of what happened next could put it back together. She looked at the door Victor had walked through. She looked at the documents spread across the dinner table. She looked at Adrian beside her. Tomorrow there would be lawyers and regulatory calls and a legal process that would grind through everything with the impersonal efficiency of institutions doing what they were designed to do. Tomorrow there would be a wedding, or there wouldn't be, but that decision would be theirs, made by them, chosen, which was the only way a decision like that should ever be made. Tonight, there was just this: the room, the witnesses, the documents on the table, and the fact that she had walked in here with nothing but what she knew and what she could not afford to lose. And she had not lost it. She squeezed Adrian's hand once. Then she looked at Hartwell making his call in the corner, and Margaret with her own phone out, and Davies staring at the floor, and Serena sitting in the chair with her hands in her lap, and the financial associate still studying the pages on the table, and the caterers frozen at the edges of the room, unsure whether to clear the plates. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something ends and something else hasn't started yet. This is the seam. She had one more thing to do before morning. The caterers didn't know what to do with the plates. Elara noticed that detail in the strange, slowed-down quality that followed the adrenaline. The two young men in white jackets standing at the edge of the room, with their hands at their sides and their eyes moving between the documents on the table, and the guests who had stopped being guests and become something else. Witnesses, maybe? Or participants, and the untouched desserts on their trays growing warm and irrelevant. Nobody had told them to clear. Nobody had told them to stay. They were just there, present at something they hadn't been hired to be present at, doing the only thing left to do in the absence of instruction, which was nothing. She understood the feeling. She let go of Adrian's hand. Not because she wanted distance. She didn't. She wanted the opposite of distance. She wanted to sit down somewhere quiet with him and not speak for a long time. But there were still things in motion, and she needed her hands free and her head clear, and the warmth of his presence was beginning to work against the clarity she still required. "Hartwell," she said. He looked up from his phone. His call was on hold, one finger pressed to his ear. "Make sure Davies is in the room when you make that call," she said. "He needs to hear it from the source." Hartwell nodded, glanced at Davies, and Davies, who had the look of a man who had spent the last 40 minutes understanding the shape of his own mistake and increasing resolution, stood without being asked and followed Hartwell to the far corner. The room was thinning. People were leaving in the way people leave difficult events, quietly, in pairs, with the slightly accelerated movement of those who want to have been somewhere else when they process what they've seen. She didn't try to stop them. They had witnessed what needed to be witnessed. The rest was paperwork and process. Margaret stopped beside her on her way to make her own calls. She was a compact woman, and she looked at Elara directly, without the social cushioning that most people applied to looks like this, and she said, "You should have a lawyer on the phone before midnight." "I know. I have someone. Independent. She doesn't owe anyone in this network anything." She held out a card. Old-fashioned, heavy paper, the kind of card you kept because you might need it someday. "Call her tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." Elara took the card. "Thank you." Margaret looked at her for a moment longer. "You did well," she said. Not warmly, accurately, the way you'd assess a structural calculation that had held under load. Then she moved toward the corridor. That left Serena. Serena was still in the chair where she had sat down after Elara called her back from the door, and she had not moved in the 40 minutes since, had sat there while the room reorganized itself around the aftermath, while the lawyers retreated and the witnesses dispersed, and the documents on the table were photographed and the evening unwound from the shape it had been designed to have into the shape it had actually become. She had sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance and her phone face down on the chair beside her, and she had not cried, which Elara had half expected, and she had not tried to speak, which she had also half expected, and what she had done instead was simply sit, very still, in the way of someone who has arrived at the end of a road and is waiting to find out what happens to people who arrive at the end of roads. Elara walked over. She pulled a chair from the nearest table and set it down facing Serena, and sat in it, and the two of them were eye level with each other for the first time all evening, which was the first time in over a year that they had been eye level at all. Alara had spent 14 months slightly below Serena's performance, slightly within the radius of her management, and this was different. This was just two people sitting in chairs with nothing between them. Serena looked at her. Her face, stripped of the performance, was both more and less than Alara had expected. More tired, less monstrous. The tiredness was the surprise. The deep structural exhaustion of someone who had been maintaining a sustained deception for over a year, which was not a small thing, which required a constant expenditure of attention and energy that left marks regardless of how good you were at it. And Serena had been very good at it. That was the part Alara kept coming back to, not in anger, but in something that felt more like the aftermath of anger, which was a kind of bewildered grief. She had been very good. "How much?" Alara said. Serena blinked. "The money." "What did he offer you?" A pause. Serena's hands moved in her lap, fingers pressing together. $2 million, up front. Her voice was flat, used up. Another $3 million when the marriage ended and the fraud exposure hit. $5 million. Alara sat with that number, turned it over. She thought about her cousin. About the version of her cousin she had believed in. The woman who had driven 4 hours to sit with her the night her mother died. The woman who had shown up at the museum with coffee and no explanation on the days Alara had called and said she was struggling. She thought about how much of that had been real and how much had been maintenance, and realized she could not separate them cleanly, and that was perhaps the worst thing. Not that it was all false, that she couldn't find where the true parts ended. "Did any of it matter to you?" She asked it simply, without accusation in her voice, because she genuinely wanted to know, and performance had left the building an hour ago. "Any of it." Serena looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, just the one word. "Which parts?" Serena's jaw tightened. "Does it help?" "Knowing." "I'm asking." Another pause. The sound of the estate around them, the distant staff voices, the ocean below the cliffs, everything continuing at its own pace regardless. "Your mother's funeral," Serena said finally. "That was real. What I felt that day was real." She stopped. Her throat moved. "Most of the early part was real, before Victor. He approached you before I met Adrian. 3 weeks after you started seeing him, before I even knew you were serious." Serena looked at her hands. "He was very thorough about his timing. And you said yes." "I said yes." "Because of the money." Serena was quiet for a moment, then, "Because I was tired." She looked up, and her eyes were dry and very direct. "I know how that sounds. I know there's no version of that sentence that doesn't sound like an excuse. I'm not offering it as an excuse. You asked which parts were real, and the part that was real was also the reason I said yes. I was tired, Elle, of watching you and everyone like you get to have the thing you wanted without, I know how it sounds. Say it anyway. Without having to fight for it the way I had to fight for everything. You never had to fight. Things arrived for you. People loved you. Good things found you. Adrian Vale fell in love with you without you trying. And I was standing right next to you watching it happen, and Victor called and he offered me something and I... She stopped, started again. I told myself it was just business, that you'd be fine, that people like you always landed fine. The silence between them had weight and texture. Alara sat inside it and felt the specific pain of recognizing something she would not have expected to recognize, the logic of it. Not the morality. The morality was clear and she was not confused about it. But the logic. The human, exhausted, corrosive logic of a person who had watched someone else's life from close range for a long time and let the watching become something it shouldn't have. I need to ask you something, Alara said, and I need the actual answer. Serena waited. The messages between you and Victor. The ones about the post-wedding scandal, the affair they were going to manufacture. She kept her voice even. How is that going to work? Something crossed Serena's face. Elle, I need to know, all of it. Serena exhaled slowly. After the wedding, first week of the honeymoon, Victor had a man, someone Adrian had met twice at business events, nothing significant, They were going to place fabricated communications, texts, emails, make it look like Adrian had been seeing him on the side for 8 months. She paused. The plan was for me to find them and bring them to you. Your destroyed reaction would be documented. Victor's legal team would use it to support a narrative of marital instability that justified the company board taking protective action against Adrian's judgment and, by extension, his financial decisions. Which would point to me, Ilara said, since my name was already on the Blackstone documents. Yes, and if I hadn't found the backup files. You wouldn't have had any reason to look for it, Serena said quietly. It would have happened the way it was designed. You would have been blindsided by the affair evidence and devastated by the marriage ending, and then the fraud charges would have arrived and you wouldn't have had the context to fight them. Ilara sat with that for a moment. The full shape of what it would have been. The version of this year where she had not opened the backup folder, had not looked at the folder she didn't recognize, had not had the trained instinct to look at things that were slightly wrong below the surface. She thought about the woman she had been the morning of part 1, standing at the window of her bridal suite, watching the ocean hit the cliffs, pressing her palm to the cold glass, feeling the wrongness without yet being able to name it. That woman had not known, but something in her had already known that something was wrong. Something in her had been already turning toward the answer without being able to see it yet. She would have found it, she thought, even without the backup folder. It would have taken longer, would have been more dangerous, would have caught her at a different stage of the trap. But she would have found it. She liked to believe that. She couldn't be certain of it, but she liked to believe it. What happens to me now? Serena said. It was not a manipulative question. It had none of the texture of manipulation, which Ilara could now read with the accuracy of someone who had been inside it for over a year. It was a genuine question from a person sitting at the end of her road. That depends on what you're willing to do, Ilara said. The regulatory investigation will want testimony. Everything you have, the messages, the timeline, the operational details of what Victor instructed you to do. All of it, on record. And in exchange? I'm not a prosecutor. I can't offer you anything formal. She paused. What I can tell you is that the difference between being a co-conspirator and being a cooperating witness is significant. And you know what you did, and you know what they did, and only one of those things was built around destroying a person who had never done anything to hurt you. Serena looked at her hands again. I'll testify, she said. Not immediately. It took another beat, a breath, the internal movement of a person stepping off something high. I'll give them everything. Ilara stood. She looked down at Serena in the chair, her cousin, her oldest friend, the woman who had been both of those things, and also something else, something that didn't have a clean name. And she felt the full, irresolvable complexity of it settle into her chest where it would live from now on, as scars live, not painlessly, but permanently, and as scars do eventually, with the possibility of being survived. I'm going to call a lawyer, Ilara said. Someone will be in touch about the testimony. She turned toward the door. L. Serena's voice from the chair. She stopped. Did not turn around. I'm sorry. A pause. I know, Ilara said. She left. The corridor was quiet. The estate at 11 at night had the particular stillness of a large building that has absorbed a significant event and is now in the process of processing it through its walls and floors, and Ilara walked through the quiet with Margaret's card in her hand and her phone out and the lawyer's number already being dialed. The call lasted 40 minutes. She made it standing in the small sitting room near the east corridor, the same corridor she had used to access Victor's office, which felt like years ago now, though it had been that same day. The lawyer's name was Diana Cho, and she had the focused, unhurried quality of someone who had been called at 11 at night many times before and had developed a professional relationship with urgency that kept it from becoming panic. She listened to everything. She asked 15 questions. She said, "Don't speak to anyone from the regulatory board without me present. Don't access the Blackstone documents again. Don't delete anything. I'll have a cease and desist on the protective removal filed by 8 tomorrow morning." "Will it hold?" Ilara asked. "The removal? Against what you have? It won't survive the week." Ilara exhaled through her nose. "And my name on the directorship. Handwriting forensics take 10 days standard, 6 if I push. We'll have preliminary findings before any formal charges could be filed. A pause. Mrs. Vale, Whitmore. I'm still Whitmore. A beat. Ms. Whitmore. You moved quickly tonight. That mattered. The public record in that room, 40 witnesses, phone documentation, the testimony of 2 board-adjacent figures, that's not a small thing. Victor Vale is going to have very expensive lawyers, and they are going to work very hard, and this is not going to be fast or clean, but you have a strong position. All right, Alara said. Get some sleep. She almost laughed. I'll try. She ended the call and stood in the small sitting room for a moment with the phone in her hand and the quiet of the corridor around her, and let her shoulders come down from where they had been for approximately the past 6 hours, which was somewhere around her ears. Her body was making its accounting known. The tiredness was not the ordinary tiredness of a long day. It had a different specific gravity, the weight of sustained intensity, of a nervous system that had been running at maximum capacity for hours and was now presenting the bill. Her feet hurt. Her jaw ached from the sustained effort of keeping her face controlled. There was a headache beginning behind her left eye that she recognized as the kind that settled in after extreme concentration and would take 12 hours of sleep to fully resolve. She went upstairs. Adrian was in the suite. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, still dressed, jacket off, and he had a glass of water in his hand, and he was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who has been sitting with something difficult for a while. He looked up when she came in. She closed the door. They looked at each other across the room. Cho? He said. Yes. She's filing the cease and desist in the morning. He nodded. I have my own legal team moving on the Blackstone structure. They'll coordinate. A pause. The regulatory board chair called Hartwell back. They're opening a formal inquiry into the petition. It'll be examined in context. Good. The word came out flat. Not because she felt flat. She felt about 15 things simultaneously, but because they had both been talking in operational sentences for hours, and the shift back to human sentences was going to take a moment. He set down the water glass. Come here, he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the edge of the bed, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they were both quiet for a while, which was the first quiet that had felt like actual quiet all day, the first silence that wasn't loaded with the things unsaid or the things being managed or the things she was watching for. She thought about what she needed to say to him. She had told him she would say it, had told him in the library that when this was over, they would have a conversation about what it meant to protect someone by hiding truth from them. She had meant it. She still meant it. But she sat in the quiet and realized that she was not ready to have that conversation tonight, and that not being ready was not the same as not being able, and that there was a difference between things that needed to be said soon and things that needed to be said right now, and this was not right now. Right now was this: the room, the quiet, his arm around her, both of them still standing. The dress? She said. He shifted slightly beside her. What about it? You said it was restored, the original one. Yes. I want to see it. A pause. Then he stood and crossed to the wardrobe and opened it, and there it was, the cream silk, the hand-embroidered bodice, hanging in the same position the replacement dress had occupied, but itself, entirely itself, the water staining gone as if it had never happened, the embroidery threads restored to their original lie along the bodice. She didn't know how he'd done it, what specialist he'd found, what it had cost in time or money, and she didn't ask. She stood up and walked to it and touched the sleeve. The silk was cool under her fingers, the same as it had always been. She thought about her mother, about standing in a shop 3 years ago looking at this dress, with her mother's hands on her shoulders, and her mother saying, this is the one, I can tell. And the particular quality of her mother's certainty, which had been one of the most reliable things in Alara's life, and which she had been missing, steadily and specifically, ever since. The dress was not her mother. She knew that. Objects were not people, and sentiment was not memory. But it was the thing her mother had touched with that certainty, and that made it worth carrying forward, worth restoring, worth wearing into whatever tomorrow was going to be. We're still getting married? She said. Not uncertain. It was a genuine question, asked with the equanimity of someone for whom the answer mattered, but would not determine the landscape either way. I want to, Adrian said. If you want to. I want to. She touched the embroidery. But differently. What does that mean? It means not for them. Not the performance, not the 43 witnesses, not the statement to the Vale family's social world. She let her hand fall from the dress and turned to look at him. Just us. The people we actually choose, whatever that looks like. He was quiet for a moment. There are contracts with the estate through tomorrow. I don't care about the contracts. No, he said. I know. I meant we could, if you wanted. The estate is paid for. The space is here. We could do it tomorrow with fewer people. She thought about it. The ballroom downstairs, the Atlantic outside, the cliffs below where the ocean had been hitting all day, the flowers that were still arranged because no one had told the florists otherwise, the ceremony space that had been built around a performance and could be converted into something else. How many people? She said. However many you want. Hartwell and Margaret, she said. They've earned it. Diana Cho, if she can make it up the coast by noon, which I doubt, but we can ask. She paused. The estate staff who were in that room tonight, they stood there through the whole thing and nobody gave them permission to leave. Something moved across Adrian's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. The caterers, she confirmed, and nobody from your parents' world, nobody who was there because of the power architecture, just, she stopped. People who saw what actually happened, he said. Yes. He looked at her. The room was quiet around them. Outside, the Atlantic was doing what it did, which was continue regardless. All right, he said. That's what we'll do. She nodded, looked at the dress one more time. Then she looked at him, at the man she had been about to marry when she'd pressed her palm to a cold window 3 days ago and felt the wrongness she couldn't yet name. The man who had kept secrets she had needed to know, and who had also, in whatever complicated combination of fear and strategy and genuine feeling, tried to protect something he could not afford to lose, in the only way he knew how. She was not finished being angry about that. She was also not finished loving him. Both of those things would continue to be true simultaneously for as long as they were honest with each other, and honesty was going to be the new architecture of this thing, whatever it was called. She was going to make sure of that, but not tonight. Tonight she was going to sleep because her body was making demands that her will could no longer override, and the headache behind her left eye had made its full presence known, and the lawyer was handling what the lawyer could handle, and everything else would be there in the morning exactly where she'd left it. She sat back down on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes and set them on the floor and lay back with her arms at her sides and stared at the ceiling. Adrian sat beside her, then lay back too, and they were both quiet and both still and both awake in the specific way of people who have been through something that hasn't yet decided to let them go. Victor, she said to the ceiling. I know. What happens to him? A pause. The inquiry. The forensic audit. The Blackstone exposure. It's going to take time, but... He stopped. He loses the company. Whatever influence he has over the board, the money he took gets traced and the legal process begins. Another pause. He'll have lawyers for years. He's a wealthy man, and wealthy men have options. But the social position, the reputation he spent his entire life building, his voice was flat, not triumphant. That's already gone. That happened tonight in that room. She thought about Celeste on the terrace. I've underestimated you. The goodbye underneath the sentence. And Celeste, she said. I don't know. He was honest about it. She knew. What happens to people who knew and didn't stop it, I genuinely don't know. Elara thought about Celeste setting down her champagne glass at the rehearsal dinner, the small sound of it. Victor. It's enough. The fracture in her voice. Two people at the end of a long road that had taken them somewhere neither had articulated they were going, and Celeste choosing, at the last possible moment, to stop. It had not been an act of courage. It had been an act of exhaustion. She understood the difference, but it had still been a stop. She'll have to live with what she knew, and when she knew it, Elara said. That's not nothing. No, Adrian agreed. It's not nothing. The ceiling of the suite was plaster, old, with a faint pattern of leaves pressed into it that she had noticed on her first night and thought was beautiful, in the way of things made by hands before manufacturing. She looked at it now and thought about all the ceilings she had studied in her career. Museum galleries, private collections, historic estates where the art was not on the walls but above you, where looking up was the only way to see it. She had spent her career learning to look at things that had been deliberately hidden, objects that had survived centuries of misattribution, mishandling, the accumulated damage of people who had owned them without understanding them. She had learned to read the layers, the surface, and underneath the surface, and underneath that, the original thing, what it had actually been before everything happened to it. She thought, that is what this year has been. A layer problem, a provenance problem. You can determine the provenance of almost anything if you're patient and methodical and honest about what the evidence is actually telling you versus what you want it to tell you. She had been patient. She had been methodical. She had been, in the end, honest about what it was. The headache was subsiding slightly. The tiredness was winning, settling into her body with the completeness of something that had been waiting for permission. "Sleep," Adrian said without looking at her. "I know." "You're still thinking at the ceiling." "I'm always thinking at the ceiling." "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling too, and in the low light of the suite, with his jacket off and the controlled performance of him absent, he looked younger and more tired and more specifically himself than he did in any other context. She had fallen in love with this version, the one that appeared when the rooms were empty and the people were gone. The version that went and sat in libraries not to read but to exist without performing. "I love you," she said. "Not the way you say it as reassurance or as conclusion. The way you say it when it is simply the accurate description of a fact." He turned his head to look at her. "I know that right now that coexists with being angry at you," she said. "I want you to know I know the difference." "I know you know the difference," he said. "Good." She looked back at the ceiling. "Then we understand each other." "We always have," he said. "That's the part neither of us had a name for." She closed her eyes. The ocean was audible from here if she listened for it, distant, rhythmic, the sound of something that had been doing the same thing for longer than anyone currently alive, and would keep doing it after everyone in this building was gone. It was not a comforting sound exactly, not warm, not the sound of anything that cared about any of this, but it was honest. It did what it did. It hit the cliffs and pulled back and hit them again, not because it was trying to warn anyone or meant anything by it, but because that was its nature, and it had not modified its nature to accommodate the complicated things happening above it. She thought, I could learn something from that. In the morning, the estate would be the same estate, and the legal machinery would be in motion, and there would be calls and documents, and the long, unglamorous process of accountability working its way through the people who had tried to use her. It would not feel like victory. It would feel like work, because that was what the aftermath of crisis felt like. Not triumph, but the return of ordinary difficulty, the problems that were manageable instead of catastrophic, the daily weight instead of the sudden unbearable one. She was ready for that. She was, she discovered, more ready for ordinary difficulty than she had ever been before, because she understood now in a way she had not previously understood, not intellectually, in her body, in the specific physical knowledge that a year of pressure builds into a person, what she was made of, what held, what bent and did not break, where the seams were and which ones were strong. She knew herself differently than she had 3 days ago. That was not nothing either. Sometime in the hour that followed, she fell asleep, not gradually, the way it happened when you were finally safe enough to stop holding on, which was sudden and complete, the way a hand opens when it no longer has to grip. She slept. Outside, the Atlantic kept going. In the morning, the estate staff found the ballroom exactly as it had been arranged for a wedding, and nobody had told them to change it, and so they didn't. The flowers were still there. The chairs were still arranged in their rows. The light through the tall windows was the particular clear light that followed a night of wind off the ocean, sharp and clean, and without the amber softness that flatters things into looking better than they are. Just light. What things actually looked like in it. Alara came downstairs at 9 in the vintage gown, restored, the cream silk and the embroidery, and nothing else. And she walked through the ballroom alone first, before anyone else, the way she sometimes walked through museum galleries before they opened, needing the space to herself to understand what it was before it became what other people made of it. She walked the length of it, the chairs, the altar space, the flowers in their arrangements along the windows. She stopped at the end and looked back at the room and thought about the woman who had pressed her palm to a cold window 3 days ago and felt the wrongness she couldn't yet name, and thought about who that woman was now, this morning, in this light. The same woman. Not the same, both of those things, simultaneously, which was just what life did to you if you let it. Hartwell arrived at 10:30. Margaret at 11, with Diana Cho beside her, who had driven up the coast at 5 in the morning because, she said, she hadn't been to a wedding in 3 years, and the cease and desist could wait 90 minutes. The estate staff arranged themselves along the walls in a way that suggested they had decided, collectively and without instruction, that they were attending rather than working. The caterers from the night before were there, still in their white jackets, which was either because they hadn't gone home or because they had gone home and come back. Adrian stood at the end of the aisle in the suit he had brought for today, and nothing else. And when Alara walked in from the back of the ballroom, the room was very quiet, and the light was coming through the windows in that sharp, clear, undecorated way. And she walked toward him the same way she had walked into the reception room the night before, like it was hers, not because she felt entitled to it, but because she had decided to stop waiting for permission. She reached him. He looked at her, at the dress, at her face. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. And they got married, not without complication. There was a moment during the vows when her voice caught on something and she stopped. Not from grief or fear, but from the full accumulated weight of everything the past 72 hours had asked of her. And she stood with it for a moment in front of these particular people in this particular light, and let it be seen, which she would not have done a year ago, which she could do now. Adrian waited. He did not reach for her or rush her. He just waited, which was the right thing, which she knew because she had chosen correctly. She finished the vows. They were married. Someone, one of the caterers, she thought, the older one with the quiet eyes, started clapping first, and the rest of the room followed. And it was not the elaborate orchestrated applause of the event that had been planned, but it was real, which was worth more. Hartwell was crying, which surprised her, and when she looked at him, he straightened up and looked deliberately at the ceiling, and she looked away to let him have the privacy of it. Margaret did not cry. She raised her water glass and nodded once, which was, Alara thought, the most Margaret thing that had ever happened. Diana Cho said, afterward, shaking Alara's hand, "I've seen a lot of cases. People who'd been through a fraction of what you went through this week fell apart in my office and took months to get functional." She paused. "I don't know what you're made of, but hold on to it." "I'm working on figuring that out," Alara said. "Let me know when you do." Diana handed her a business card, which she already had, and Alara took it anyway. "I'll be in touch about the inquiry." Then she was gone, and the estate staff were clearing the flowers with a quiet efficiency that suggested the building was reasserting its professional nature around the margins of what had happened in it. And Hartwell and Margaret were talking in the corner about board procedures with the focused energy of people who had found a purpose. And it was just Alara and Adrian standing in the emptying ballroom in the clear morning light. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Now what?" he said. She thought about the ocean, the cliffs below the estate where the Atlantic had been doing its work all week, patient and impersonal and honest. She thought about the path down to the shore that she had noticed when they first arrived, and had meant to take and hadn't, because there had always been something that required her attention inside the building. Nothing required her attention right now. "There's a path," she said, "down to the water." He looked toward the windows. "It's cold." "I know." A pause, then, "Yeah, okay." They walked out through the estate's side door and down the long grass slope toward the cliff path, and the wind off the Atlantic hit them immediately, cold and direct, and smelling of deep water and salt, and the particular wildness of open ocean that cities could not replicate. She had grown up near this kind of water. She had missed it without realizing how much she had missed it. The path was steep, and the grass was wet from the night, and they were both wearing the wrong shoes for it, and neither of them mentioned that. They went down. At the bottom, where the path ended at a ledge of flat rock above the waterline, she stopped and looked at the ocean. Up close, it was different than it looked from above. From the suite window, it had looked like drama, like a statement, like a warning. Down here, it was just itself. Water moving the way water moved. Big and cold and indifferent and continuous. The sound of it filling the whole of her hearing so that there was no room inside it for the other sounds. The voices and the machinery and the thousand things she had been processing for 72 hours. Just this. She breathed in through her nose. Salt and cold and the mineral smell of wet rock. Adrian stood beside her, his shoulder against hers. They didn't speak. There was nothing left that needed to be said right now. Not about last night, or about what came next, or about the conversation they still had to have. The one about truth and protection, and what a real partnership required. All of that was still there, and would be addressed and would be worked through with the same honesty she had decided was the new architecture of their life together. But right now, the ocean was doing what it did, and they were standing in the cold light of a morning that had no performance in it. And she was wearing the dress her mother had chosen, and she was married to a man she was not finished being angry at, and not finished loving either. And the investigation was in motion, and the inquiry was in motion, and the accountability was in motion, slow and grinding and imperfect and real. And she was still standing. She pressed her palm flat against the cold air in front of her. Not against glass this time, not the cold of an enclosure, but the open cold of outside, of the world itself. She held it there. The ocean hit the rocks below her, pulled back, hit them again. She breathed. And this time, for the first time in 3 days, what she felt standing at the edge of something enormous was not dread. It was just the particular, undecorated, absolute feeling of being alive in a body that had been through something and had come out the other side of it still intact, still upright, still capable of standing at the edge of the Atlantic on a cold morning with wet shoes and feeling, underneath all the damage and all the complexity and all the things that were not yet resolved, something that did not have a better name than this. Enough. She was enough. She always had been. End of story.